Mountaineering is a sport that inherently carries many, often fatal risks. Frequent viewers of my channel, I'm sure, are well aware the slopes of a mountain are far from a safe and controlled environment. Thus, as I've touched on in some of my other mountaineering videos, this risk is accepted by mountaineering's participants as a part of the experience, and although this willingness of mountaineers to take these risks may not be fully understood by many people outside the sport, when deaths do happen, it is widely accepted that the participants were at least aware of the potential risk of death while climbing, and so it makes such deaths understandable even for people with no mountaineering ambitions at all. And this is one of the very unique aspects of mountaineering and the mountaineering community, as there are few other even extreme sports that so openly admit and accept the regular deaths of its participants. Since there is usually little secrecy or shame surrounding climbers' deaths, this naturally has led to many fascinating ethical debates over the years following casualty events in the mountains. No man left behind is by no means a rule most mountaineers live by, and these tough life or death decisions to leave another mountaineer behind that sometimes must be made are all morally differing shades of gray. There are a plethora of differentiating factors that complicate these decisions, such as the inherent risk to the rescuer. After all, it's not easy to climb mountains, and high altitude only increases the stress on one's body, and feasibly hauling another climber down from high altitude, navigating steep terrain, can be near impossible, and can further jeopardize the rescuing party's safety as well. Another complicating factor is the actual difficulty of the mountain of ascent, and the effort simply needed for a potential rescue party to reach a stricken climber, as some mountains are just too difficult and dangerous for even highly experienced climbers to navigate, with an extreme example of this being Beinthe Broch, which I made a video about a while back. Beinthe Broch is just such a treacherous mountain to ascend that a rescue party of world-class climbers struggled for days, and was ultimately unable to reach the stricken climbers higher up on its slopes. However, the reasoning for leaving a stricken climber behind can also be more morally dubious, as sometimes climbers that would be able to assist another stricken climber decide to forego doing so, refusing to relinquish their goal of summiting, as was the case with Benoit Chaumou in my video about Kangchenjunga. And while an every man for himself attitude is largely commonplace within the mountaineering community, there are also the rare few mountaineers who will put their lives at risk at the opportunity to rescue a fellow climber. Anatoli Boukreev was born on January 16, 1958, in the city of Korinko in what was at the time the Soviet Union. Anatoli was born into a poor working-class family, and thus very little is known about his early life up until he graduated from high school in the year 1975. Following the completion of his high school education, Anatoli enrolled in the Chelyabinsk University for Pedagogy, enrolling into one of the university's sciences programs, opting to major in physics. While enrolled at the university, Anatoli would also take a cross-country ski course as well, which would only serve to reinforce his love for the outdoors. Anatoli graduated with his bachelor's degree in physics in 1979. Just a few years later, in 1985, he would then opt to uproot and move to Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union's mountaineering capital, to pursue his dreams of becoming a mountaineer, and quickly found himself a team to climb with. Over the next 2 years, Anatoli would hone his skills with his team before embarking on his first solo summit attempt in 1987, an ascent of the 7,134-meter Lenin Peak, which lies on the border of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Anatoli was successful at this attempt and reached the summit of Lenin Peak, an undoubtedly impressive accomplishment, and marked the first notable ascent of his mountaineering career. Clearly, Anatoli was a gifted climber, and following this solo ascent, he continued to hone his skills further over the next 2 years, before he set out on an expedition in April of 1989, Anatoli's expedition team would be attempting a new route to the summit of the world's third highest mountain, Kangchenjunga. As I mentioned in my previous video about Kangchenjunga, notably, it is considered to be one of the hardest of the 14 8,000 meter peaks in the world to summit. However, truly a testament to his rapidly improving skills, this would mark the first successful 8,000 meter plus climb of his career, climbing a new route. Anatoli's Soviet expedition team was successful in their trailblazing attempt and summited on April 15, 1989. However, after setting and completing the new route up Kangchenjunga, Anatoli and the Soviets had not quenched their Himalayan climbing ambitions, and so, just a few weeks later, on April 30th, they attempted to complete the first traverse of the 4 peaks above 8,000 meters in the Kangchenjunga Massif, which they successfully accomplished on May 2nd. Following the mass state fracturing of the Soviet Union in the early following year in 1990, Anatoli became a citizen of the state of Kazakhstan after it too formed its own sovereign state during the Soviet collapse. And with newly thawing diplomatic relations with the United States in the wake of the Soviet Union's implosion, an American climber who owned a guiding business invited Anatoli to guide some clients up Denali, and Anatoli accepted his trial job offer. Denali, the tallest mountain in North America, stands at an imposing altitude of 6,190 meters at its summit and is infamous for its bitterly cold weather and roaring winds that have claimed the lives of numerous people throughout the years, including several with extensive mountaineering and Himalayan climbing backgrounds, several of which I've covered in other videos on my channel. In April of 1990, Anatoli would successfully summit Denali with his clients, which would be the start of his guiding career with the mountain guiding agency, Mountain Madness. One of the owners of Mountain Madness, the American man who had invited him for the test run, a man named Scott Fisher, was extremely satisfied with the incidentless ascent, and recognizing Anatoli's incredible abilities, he would offer Anatoli a smattering of guide work throughout the years following. Anatoli was not satisfied with just this ascent, however, and after completing his guided ascent, Anatoli would again summit Denali, this time on his own, and at an unbelievably fast pace, following the West Rib route to the summit in just 10.5 hours, a route which normally took climbers 3 or 4 days to complete, which even wowed Denali Park rangers, who described the ascent as unreal. Huge praise coming from the usually unimpressed officials who had been hardened by years of observing highly skilled mountaineers ascend Denali slopes. The following year, in 1991, Anatoli would accompany the first Kazakh mountaineering expedition to the slopes of the 8,167 meter peak, Dhaulagiri, where the team would successfully attempt and complete a new route up the mountain's western face, reaching the summit on May 10th. Just a few months later, in early October of 1991, Anatoli would successfully guide a Mountain Madness expedition party to the summit of Mount Everest via the standard South Col route. Anatoli would largely put his personal ambitions on the back burner for most of 1992, instead opting to cut his teeth guiding for Mountain Madness, but was ultimately unable to guide his clients to any successful summits that year. In 1993, Anatoli would again summit Denali in the springtime as a warm-up for his upcoming ascent of K2 later that year in July. This ascent of K2, while successful, would also simultaneously serve as a harsh learning experience for Anatoli as well. As the strongest climber of that expedition team, Anatoli had spent the morning of October 7th fixing ropes up a steep section and was already quite exhausted before his team decided to forego making a high camp and instead decided to make an afternoon push for the summit, as the team was composed of all highly skilled mountaineers. Despite his exhaustion from the demanding climbing he had partaken in earlier in the day, he chose to endure his physical exhaustion and power through it to make a push for the summit. When he did finally reach the summit, he was so spent that he later recalled he could scarcely revel in the moment of his accomplishment at all, and worse yet, no longer blinded by his summit fever, he realized the predicament he had put himself into, later famously recounting, quote, "During my years of training as a ski racer and then as a mountaineer, I had learned how to wring out the last of my energy for a finish. But this is dangerous in mountaineering because the summit is not the finish of your competition with a great mountain. To survive, you must be able to get down from the death zone," he recalled. In the year following his harrowing K2 attempt, Anatoli set his sights on the Makalu Massif and went on to successfully summit both Makalu 1 and Makalu 2 during the spring climbing season of 1994. In May of 1995, Anatoli ascended the North Ridge route on Mount Everest. Following this ascent, he refocused his efforts into successfully guiding the president of Kazakhstan to the 4,010-meter summit of Peak Abai, which they reached on June 30th. Later that year, in early October, Anatoli returned to Dhaulagiri and swiftly ascended the 8,167-meter peak at a blistering pace, reaching the top on October 8th, just 17 hours and 15 minutes from when he'd left base camp, which set the record for the fastest ascent of the peak. Finally, that winter, he would again join the Kazakh team for their second official expedition, this time to Manaslu, which was similarly successful to his other endeavors that year. In the spring of 1996, Anatoli would return to Mount Everest to lead Scott Fisher's Mountain Madness expedition team to the summit via the South Col route. However, this expedition would not go as smoothly as his 1991 ascent via the South Col had, and as many of you watching are likely aware, Anatoli and Scott's Mountain Madness expedition team would be one of the catalysts in the series of deadly events that would become the most well-known mountaineering disaster of all time, as 12 people would perish on the mountain that spring. For simplicity's sake, I'll be glossing over most of the details of the tragic events on Mount Everest in 1996, as there is no shortage of books, films, and other media detailing the series of events that transpired on May 10th and 11th, 1996, if you aren't familiar with the topic already. As one of the leaders of the Mountain Madness expedition, Anatoli was tasked with looking after 3 of the group's climbers, Charlotte Fox, Sandy Pittman, and Tim Madsen. After a rope setting mishap had delayed the party's ascent to the summit, Anatoli, who was no doubt the strongest climber of those ascending on May 10th, easily outpaced the rest of the summit hopefuls, despite the fact that Anatoli was climbing without the use of supplemental oxygen, and he was the first to reach the summit that afternoon at 1:07 p.m., where he then lingered in the area near the summit to help other people complete their ascents for the next 90 minutes. At 3:07 p.m. that afternoon, Anatoli began his descent to Camp 4, which he reached at approximately 5 p.m. He intended to recuperate at Camp 4 for a little while, and then head back up the slopes with extra bottled oxygen and hot tea for his clients, but just under an hour after he arrived at Camp 4, the weather began to foul. Soon after the weather began to turn, word had reached Camp 4 of the climbers that were lost on Everest's upper slopes, which included his 3 clients, and so Anatoli leapt into action and again began to ascend towards the summit, after spending hours fighting through the whiteout conditions and the bitter, unrelenting cold. At approximately midnight, Anatoli managed to locate Pittman, Fox, and Madsen, who were huddling for warmth, along with a Japanese woman named Yasuko Namba from another expedition, and unbeknownst to Anatoli at the time, a man named Beck Weathers, who had lost consciousness but had not died, was also laying just mere feet away from the others. Anatoli opted to assist Pittman, Fox, and Madsen to Camp 4, but was forced to leave Namba behind as she was at this point on the cusp of death, and she would subsequently die. Beck Weathers famously just woke up the next day and stumbled into Camp 4 somehow, rather miraculously. Ultimately, Anatoli had saved the lives of his 3 clients and was praised for his brave and heroic efforts in the rescue of the stricken climbers, and his efforts in locating some of the deceased climbers, including Scott Fisher, in the aftermath as well. However, this praise was not unanimous, as he was also criticized for climbing at a faster pace than his clients and descending without them as well, and was further scrutinized for refusing to use supplemental oxygen while working as a guide. Despite the loss of his friend and employer, Scott Fisher, in the 1996 Everest disaster, this event ultimately did not dissuade Anatoli from his further mountaineering ambitions, and just 6 days later on May 17th, he would complete a solo ascent of the nearby 8,516 meter peak Lhotse, tearing his way up the mountain from base camp to the summit in a mere 21 hours and 6 minutes, setting the record for the speediest ascent of the peak in the process as well. Later that year, during the 1996 fall climbing season, he would go on to complete 2 further ascents of 8,000 meter peaks, Cho Oyu and Shisha Pangma, on September 25th and October 9th, respectively. The following spring, in April of 1997, Anatoli returned to Mount Everest to guide an Indonesian military expedition to the summit, which he successfully accomplished on May 24th. Much like he had the previous year, following his ascent of Mount Everest, he would again successfully summit Lhotse on May 23rd, with the longer delay between ascents than the previous year partially due in part to complications from the dramatic events involving his fellow Kazakh countrymen that unfolded on Mount Everest again in 1997, a topic I made a video about if you'd like to learn more about that. Following his ascent of Lhotse, he would further go on to complete solo ascents of Broad Peak and Gasherbrum 2 on July 7th and July 14th respectively. However, later that year, in December of 1997, Anatoli would embark on his most ambitious ascent to date. For this expedition, Anatoli would be joined by another of mountaineering's elite, an Italian climber named Simone Moro, and by a Kazakh cameraman to document their climb named Dmitry Sobolev. The trio would be attempting to ascend the treacherous, steep, and at the time unclimbed southern face of Annapurna, which, if you'd like to know more in detail about the many hazards of the south face, I suggest you check out my Annapurna disaster video, as that disaster took place on this southern face. However, as the trio arrived at the foot of the southern face, they concurred that the conditions on the southern face were too volatile, and so they decided instead to attempt to ascend Annapurna via another unclimbed route that followed a long ridge up Annapurna South and across a traverse to Annapurna's main summit. On December 25th, Christmas Day 1997, the team had been making solid progress up the route and were ascending the eastern face of the aforementioned ridge and had reached an approximate altitude of 5,700 meters by noon. Just a few minutes later, as Simone Moro led the trio up the ridge, a massive cornice that loomed above them suddenly broke loose, and upon impacting the mountain's face, shattered into many huge chunks of ice that scattered and created a massive avalanche in its wake. Simone saw the cornice break and had a moment to brace for the incoming avalanche, and shouted out for Anatoli and Dmitry to do the same. The massive rushing wall of snow swept up the 3 men and violently hurled them down on Annapurna's face, where they came to rest in a massive avalanche debris field approximately 800 feet below where they had been swept up by the avalanche. Miraculously, Simone managed to stay on top of the avalanche as it swept them down the mountain, and although he had sustained serious injuries, he at least had not been buried by the avalanche. However, unfortunately, the same could not be said for Dmitry nor Anatoli, who were nowhere to be found. As news of the horrific incident spread, a rescue effort was quickly organized to search for the missing men. However, the volatile weather conditions that lashed on Annapurna meant that search teams on foot were slow to progress, and the weather further rendered helicopter searches largely useless. That is, when the weather was even permitting enough for them to fly at all. By the time the calendar had turned to 1998, hope had significantly dwindled for the pair's survival, and on January 4th, 1998, a team of Kazakh climbers reached the site of the debris field, where they were still unable to locate the men's bodies, and subsequently, the search was called off. Anatoli's girlfriend, a woman named Linda Wiley, broke the news of his death to the media, stating, quote, "There is no longer any hope of finding him alive. I only hope the searchers will locate his body for a proper burial in a crevasse. Anatoli would like to stay in the mountains," she said. Further searches for the duo's bodies have yielded further evidence of their demise, as one of the cameras the team had been using was later found by a Sherpa searcher combing the debris field. Thank you all for watching.